Let's get started on part 2 of module 7. We are on lesson 2, modifying virtual machines. In this section we will look at adding or modifying virtual hardware. And let's look at the situation where we have an overloaded virtual machine. We see that this is maxed out on RAM, maxed out on processor utilization, and maxed out on disk space. So what we can do is we can allocate additional CPUs, more RAM, more hard disk space, and additional network interface cards. So let's look at adding and modifying virtual hardware. I will go to my virtual machine, right click, select Edit Settings, and under Memory we can see we initially only assigned 4 gig of RAM to this operating system, to this virtual machine, and that was enough at the time, but as utilization has increased, 4 gig is not enough. So to assign it more RAM, all we have to do is take the little slider bar and slide it from 4 up to 8, and assuming we have sufficient RAM in our ESXi host, this now assigns 8 gig of RAM to this virtual machine. Let's look at CPUs. When we initially created this virtual machine, we only assigned it 1 CPU, and that was enough at the time. But as it's gotten overloaded, it's required more. So we can now assign more CPUs to this virtual machine. Now, the risk is, notice, changing the number of virtual CPUs after the guest operating system is installed might make the virtual machine unstable. So verify that the operating system supports the increase in the number of CPUs without a reinstall. We will increase that to 2 CPUs. And then under hard disk, when we initially created this virtual machine, we allocated 40 gig, and that was sufficient. Now it's maxed out. So to increase it, to double it, all we have to do is type in 80 gig, and assuming we have sufficient free space on our VMFS data store, then we can assign it 80 gig of hard disk space. Or another thing we can do is we can add an additional hard disk. We could click on Add and add hard disk, and we could add an additional virtual hard disk. Under CD DVD, this is something we might want to reconfigure. Right now, the virtual machine and the guest operating system in the virtual machine, when it reads the DVD, it reads the DVD and the DVD reader, which is in the ESXi host, which you would expect. DVD reader comes out, you drop the disk in it. However, you could also have the DVD on the virtual machine correspond to an ISO file, which you have downloaded from VMware, or you could even have it correspond to the DVD reader on the vSphere client. We will leave it configured on the physical ESXi host DVD reader. And under network adapter, right now it is assigned a single gigabit network interface card, and we could increase that to 2, and we might want to do that if we want to implement network interface card teaming, whereby 2 network interface cards work in tandem to provide greater throughput. Another option is what they call raw device mapping under disk options. We talked about creating a new virtual hard disk. And there's an option under here that says raw device mappings give your virtual machine direct access to the storage area network. This option allows you to use existing SAN commands to manage the storage and continue to access it using a data store. What this means is that the guest operating system writes directly to the disk array. In other words, it bypasses the virtual hard disk encapsulation process. Typically, this is not recommended. However, for some applications that require direct LUN access from the storage area network, such as Microsoft cluster services or Microsoft failover services, that's the situation where you would use raw device mapping. Inflating a thin provision disk. We discussed earlier that when you create a new virtual hard disk, you can thin provision, and thin provision disk initially takes up less space on the data store. Well, what we can do is inflate that thin provision disk, and what that means is we are going to inflate that disk so it will actually claim all the disk space that it has been assigned before another VM does the same thing. So we will go to our data store, right click on the data store, select properties, and select this virtual hard disk. Notice the provision size is 41 gig, but the actual size it's using on the data store is only 7.4 gig. So to claim all that space as ours, we right click and we select inflate, and that inflates the thin provisioned virtual disk. Let's now look at virtual machine options. If we will look at these options: virtual machine name, guest operating system, etc. Let's go to our virtual machine, right click and select edit settings, and if we select options, we can see there are options such as virtual machine name, which we could change, but if we did, it would not change the name of the .vmdk file. Under guest operating system, if we were to upgrade from Windows 2008 server to 2012 server, we might change the guest operating system, which we have selected. Under VMware Tools, we already installed VMware Tools, and under VMware Tools we can see the power controls. The square box will shut down the guests, yellow bars will suspend, and typically we want to enable the run VMware Tools scripts after power up, after resuming, before suspending, and before shutting down the guest. Under advanced, we typically do want to check and upgrade VM tools during power cycling, and you may want to select synchronize the guest operating system time with that of the ESXi host, and you may recall that we have already configured the ESXi host to synchronize with the server, the time server at the National Institute of Standards. If we then go to boot options, we can see the current boot option is configured to boot to BIOS. However, we could configure it to boot to EFS, the extended firmware interface, assuming that the guest operating system required that. Boot on power delay just makes it so when you turn on the virtual machine, there's a delay of several seconds until it actually boots up. Typically don't need this one. Under force BIOS setup, to start the BIOS on most computers, physical computers or virtual machines, after it powers up, you press the F2 key, but you got to press F2 before the operating system starts to load, and sometimes you can miss it. If you select Force BIOS Setup, then the next time the virtual machine boots, it will force entry into the BIOS setup screen. That is very convenient. Under failed boot recovery, if it doesn't boot from the boot device that you have specified, it will retry. If we select the Resources tab, we will discuss resources in a later chapter, as we will profiles and services. So the virtual machine options we looked at are virtual machine name, guest operating system, run virtual machine tools at startup, check and upgrade VM tools during power cycling, synchronize the guest operating system time with the host, boot firmware, typically BIOS or EFI, extended firmware interface for advanced systems. Power on, boot delay, forced BIOS setup, very convenient. And fail boot recovery retry. Now let's go to lesson 3, migrating virtual machines. Migrating virtual machines includes VMotion and storage VMotion. So let's look at VMotion first. Assume you have multiple virtual machines running on an ESXi host, and that ESXi host is really overloaded. So what you might want to do is move some of the virtual machines to migrate the virtual machines to a less busy host. VMotion allows you to migrate a virtual machine from one ESXi host to another ESXi host. It moves the virtual machines from one host to another, and the virtual machines remain available to the users during the migration process. So let's take a situation where we have an overloaded ESXi host and we want to migrate a machine from one host to the other. VMotion is where we have one ESXi host which is maxed out, 100% here, and we want to migrate one of the virtual machines to the other ESXi host which is only running at 25% capacity. So to do that, I select the virtual machine, right click and select migrate. I can select both host and data store, but we will simply select change host. This is VMotion moving or running VM from one ESXi host to the next. Click on next. Select the destination. Notice it's running on .10 right now. Select the destination. Click on finish. And notice it says the current active task is relocating virtual machine. And there we say that the database server virtual machine has now moved from ESXi host 10 to ESXi host 11. VMotion is where we move a virtual machine from one ESXi host to the other, and the virtual machine remains available to the users. Exposing or hiding the NXDX flag, that's no execute disable flag. You do this when your ESXi hosts are not identical. We go to the virtual machine, right click, select edit settings. Under options, under CPU ID mask, we see that hiding the NXXD flag will increase VMotion compatibility between hosts at the cost of disabling certain CPU performance features. If we look under help, we can see under the CPU identification mask that by hiding it will increase migration compatibility. By hiding the NX flag will increase VMotion compatibility, assuming the ESXi hosts are not identical. VMotion requirements map to determine whether or not VMotion will work before you run it. You can look at a requirements map and look at the error messages. So I look at this database server which I want to migrate to another ESXi host. But before I do, I look at the migration map, and if I zoom in, it shows a little red X, an error message with one of these hosts. And if I click on the error message, it says this host can't do it because there's some sort of problem accessing the storage area network. So I'd have to troubleshoot the storage area network problem. Now let's look at storage VMotion. Storage VMotion is when you're moving a virtual machine's files from one disk array to another. Whereas VMotion is you're moving a running virtual machine from one ESXi host to the other. Storage VMotion is when you're moving the virtual hard disk files from one data store, from one disk array to the other. Storage VMotion, one disk array to another disk array. Why would you want to do that? Perhaps the source disk array was getting full, or perhaps the destination disk array was much faster. So let's do it. We go to the virtual machine, we right click, we select migrate. We don't select the first option that says change host, we already did that. We select the second option that says change data store, move the virtual machine storage to another data store, click on next. Select the destination disk array, followed by next. Select the virtual disk format, the same as the source, followed by next. Click on next, and it moves the virtual machine files from one disk array to the next. VMotion moves a virtual machine's files from one data store to another. Migrating virtual machines, whereas VMotion migrates from one host to the other, storage VMotion migrates from one data store to the other. You can do it just VMotion, you can do just storage motion, or you could do both VMotion and storage VMotion simultaneously. VMotion moves a running VM from one ESXi host to another ESXi host. Storage VMotion moves the files from one disk array to the other. Summary, Lesson 2 and 3. In these lessons, we looked at modifying virtual machines, adding RAM, adding hard disk space, virtual machine options such as BIOS, boot. We looked at VMotion, and we looked at storage VMotion. And this concludes part 2 of